Hi everyone, I'm Nick Hopwood from the University of Technology, Sydney. This is the introduction to a shortish video about research design. It presents a tree-based metaphor and a 4+ part framework for thinking about research design, mainly I would say in the social sciences. If you're in class with me this semester or in future, you'll find that this is part of the flipped learning activities that I've asked you to engage with before class, and we'll be referring to this a lot during the classes or the blocks in which you're working together with me. If you're from another university or from UTS and you're not in a class with me, I hope this video stands alone and is useful to you. I'd be very happy for you to add comments saying which bits you find more helpful or whether you have any suggestions for how to improve it or different ideas. What will follow will be a Prezi presentation, so you'll stop having to look at me and you can start to see the visuals I've put together on Prezi and you'll get my commentary through it. So, here we go. You can see that what I've suggested is a tree-based metaphor, and my idea is that we can think about research design like planting seeds and trying to grow a particular kind of tree. So firstly, we have to think, well, where do we plant our seeds? Where are the roots of our tree going to stand? And we have to think, why here and not there? And in research, that means why this topic and not another one? And why a particular set of questions and not another one? We could ask an infinite number of questions about an infinite number of topics, but we don't. We choose a particular topic, and within that we ask particular questions. Why are we making that choice? Why should I or anyone else care? You may have heard me say before, nobody cares about your research until you make them care. So you have to think about, don't just take your topic for granted, but think about why you're choosing to grow your research tree in this particular area of knowledge. And usually we think about a gap in knowledge to do that. If you are seriously thinking about going ahead and doing research, how you might find that gap is through what I call a neighbourhood analysis. And interestingly, what you can think of is flipping the idea. It's not about finding a hole in research, it's about trying to find what gets closest to your research. Really diligent literature research, literature reviews and searches. Try to find the person who's stolen your idea. Who has got closest to doing what you're doing? And what is in your wider area? You have to understand what's closest, that may be most significant for shaping you, but also the broader field. Often students have said, oh, well, there's no research or there's only 2 studies in my area, so I can only review 2 things. That wouldn't be right. You'd have to go to a wider area and look at research that might have a bearing on what you're thinking about. I like the idea of the neighbourhood. Who's your next door neighbour? Whose wall is right up next to your house in your research? Who's in your suburb? Who's further away in the next nearest city? And who's in your country or your continent? When I talk about the tree metaphor, we're building a solid research trunk. It's maybe not as high as you think. The height we need to do is only going beyond what we already know. That's where your contribution to knowledge lies. So you don't want to build a trunk that's way too tall and thin, like the emergent trees that burst through the canopy of a tropical rainforest. I think it's better to plan something that you can make thick and sturdy so that it doesn't collapse if something goes a bit wrong, or it stands up to the criticism that some of your colleagues may subject your research to. Thickness and sturdiness come from the relevance of your methods and your design, which I'll talk about in a second, to your research questions, and to the quality of the evidence or data that you generate or collect. I do think it's important to think that research design is an ongoing process and you have to nurture your research. Just as if you were growing a tree, you'd have to keep checking on it and make sure the conditions were right for it to grow. So, there's a really useful resource, particularly if you're doing qualitative research, but I think it applies quite generally, by Chanel called Keeping Things Plumb in Qualitative Research. You can look at that, it's freely available online, it's from an open access journal. What that means is checking that your questions, theory, design and methods all line up. If you find that they don't, maybe your data is telling you something that's not answering your questions, you have lots of options. You maybe change the way you're collecting your data, or maybe you realise there's a new question that you want to ask. What you have the resources to do, i.e. what you can feed your study with, depends on practicalities, ethics and access. And there's no shame in doing those things. Very few studies are designed under perfect conditions with infinite funding, infinite human resources available, no ethical constraints that have to be brought in mind, and no issues to do with access. Compromise is not a dirty word. What's better, particularly if you're learning to do research, is reflecting on what the implications of particular decisions or limitations are on the contribution that your study can make. It's much better to do a practically constrained and ethically rigorous study and to reflect on what this means and how you might do it again than to ignore the practicalities and embark on something that's really not doable. Now we come to my 4-part or 4+ part design framework. The 4 parts are strategy, sampling, methods, techniques, and the plus part is analysis, because I don't think analysis is an afterthought. Part 1 is strategy. This is what your general research approach is like, and there are lots of different words you can use to signal this, and they'll mean a lot to other researchers to set the tone for your research. You might say, I'm doing a survey. Okay, people know you're going to be involving quite a large number of people, usually with some kind of questionnaire into it. You might say, I'm doing an experiment or an intervention. It might be a quasi-experiment or a trial. You may say ethnography, case study, or collaborative action research, a longitudinal study, or you may say you're just using Indigenous methodologies. All these things convey a lot of information about the kind of research you're doing, and they also lead on to questions of sampling, which is part 2 of my design framework, sampling. Samples matter in all research, not just in quantitative research. So even if you're doing a very, very qualitative small-scale study, sampling is really, really crucial. Who is involved in your research? Who do you ask? Who do you talk to? Who do you observe? Who do you collaborate with and try something out with? How are these people selected? Who is left out? Who opts out? For example, if you ask people to get involved and not everybody agrees, what does this mean for what you can claim and what you conclude from your research? What is your relationship to participants, and how and why does this matter? Knowing people and having a familiarity with them isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could be a strength of your research, because it shows that if you're doing interviews, for example, that people may trust you and be open with you. Often students tend to think that more might mean better, and that's something to really, really think carefully about. Would it compromise on the depth you can go to with people? Would it compromise on your ability to analyse the data in proper depth? If you had 100 interviews versus having 15, could you look more carefully at the 15? Samples can be big or small. They can be homogeneous, meaning they comprise lots of people with similar kind of characteristics, or diverse, meaning you try and combine lots of different qualities in your sample. They can be random, or they could be targeted, specifically asking for particular people deliberately. The thing for you to ask is whose involvement in what kind of ways best helps answer your research questions. In the speech there I added in what kind of ways, and that leads us to the part 3, which is methods. There are lots and lots of different research methods, and this is not an exhaustive list. You might use pre and post tests, give students or some participants a test at the beginning, do something and see if they've learned something, and test them again at the end. You might use a questionnaire if you were doing a survey. You might use interviews, you might do observations, you might gather documents, you might use a range of visual methodologies. Obviously there are also focus groups and collaborative and design experiments, a huge number. I think it's worth thinking before you get into the nitty-gritty of how you do those, which is what I call techniques, part 4, you have to ask how they line up with, or in Chennai's words, how they're plumb with, your research questions. RQs stands for research questions. I think it's nice to ask what each kind of method gives you evidence of. Interviews or surveys, for example, do not give you evidence of what's going on inside people's heads. They give you evidence of what people say or write on a survey when you ask them a particular question. It's an effect of an interaction. A survey gives you 5 options, a strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. The answer is a property of the options you gave them. Similarly, in an interview, if you ask particular questions and you're a particular person, so for me, I'm a male of a particular age and a particular skin colour with a particular accent that reveals that I'm English, the way people respond to me will be, you can't deny that it'll be influenced by that. Observation data is not data about what really happens out there. It's about what you notice and note down when present at a particular thing. Documents are about what the authors wrote at a particular time, and any of you who thought about what propaganda might be, you can apply the same kind of analysis to almost any documents. What were the intentions that this person was writing for? What audience were they writing for? And it may not have been for you. Visuals, so I'm talking about photographs and videos and images from magazines and from the web and all sorts of things like that. They are evidence of how one person chose to represent something at a particular moment in time. Maybe an interview could tell you more about why, or the account that that person gives about why, or what it means to different people. What's important is what evidence you need to answer your research questions when thinking about these different methods. I've been involved in a number of assessments of students' proposals in the early stages of doctoral work, and often what I find is people plan to do lots of different methods because they can. And it's easy to say, oh, well, I could do this and that could help with that, and to end up with a study with 5 or 6 different methods. I've nothing against using more than one method, but I do think there's a difference between it being possible to do a method, or it making sense to do a method in a broader sense, and it being really, really the best thing to do. I would argue that perhaps challenging yourself to think about the fewest methods you could use to get the strongest evidence might be worth doing just as a kind of test. Part 4 of my framework is techniques. This is about how you do the methods. And this is where we get to the really fine-grained art of social science research. If you're giving tests, what are you testing for? How do you know it gives reliable and valid measures? What kind of questions or performances do you ask of people? In a survey design, are you using open questions, closed questions? Do you give people 5 options on a Likert scale? So there's a neutral one in the middle, or 4, so you force them to either agree or disagree in some way. In an interview, how structured is it? What does your relationship with participants mean? Do you do it in a cafe? Do you do it in an office? Do you do it in a person's own territory? Do you do it somewhere neutral? How do you arrange the chairs? How do you make sure there's silence so that people can pause before they think? Are you writing notes? Are you recording it? Does that change what happens? In observation, thinking about how your presence affects the action, and does that effect matter? Often I think the reactivity effect is overstated, and people think as researchers they're more important than other people actually think they are, who are getting on with their jobs or lives in a normal way. But it's important to think about that. What do you actually notice? What are you looking for? What kind of notes do you take? Do you force yourself when observation not just to listen and write down what people say? If you're doing that, you may as well have just used a voice recorder. What are you actually seeing? What are you feeling? What are you touching? In visual methodologies, who creates the images? Sometimes you can use photo elicitation and provide images for participants. In self-directed photography, participants create the images themselves. How do you share these images with participants? What do participants do with them? Are you just asking them to look at them, to sort them, to comment on them, to explain what they mean? I think here there is an aesthetic quality in any technique we do, including the very quantitative ones. What I mean by that is there's art, there is judgment, not just rule following, as well as systematic rigour. I'm remembering I've got the watering can showing here that we have to keep nurturing our research, and that all aspects of design are shaped by practical and ethical considerations, as well as the research questions, and of course your personal preferences and affinities. And if you want to follow up, there's a wonderful article by Sue Clegg on the idea of affinity, or kind of personal choice or preference, in choosing theories in qualitative research. Often, it's hard to know when to stop collecting data or how big to design your study in the first place. I've talked about growing a tree that has to be certainly tall but have a thick trunk. Well, how tall is tall enough? When do you have enough data? How do you plan to have enough data? Should you plan to interview 20 people, 30, 100, 2? How many surveys should you ask? How many days should you do of observation? Often in the textbooks you'll see reference to this word, saturation, which is kind of like a sponge that can no longer absorb any more water. That means when you get more data, you stop learning or noticing anything new. If you added 2 more surveys or 1 more interview, it wouldn't change your outcomes. That's a great idea in theory, but often we don't get that far in practice because the other constraints kind of limit our research before we get there. So practicalities, logistics, ethics, time limits if you've got to produce something within a particular time field, they're fine as reasons to stop. And often we can make a lot of less data by stopping a little bit earlier than continuing until we know we have that saturation. It does mean we have to be careful about the kind of claims we make, but it's good to have what's your get out plan. When are you going to, and do that in the design stage and do that in the fieldwork stage. I mentioned analysis. This is the 4+ part framework. You can't wait until after you've got your data to start thinking about analysis. By then it will be too late. And I'm very happy to say I can say this from the voice of experience. When I did my master's research, I thought it'd be great, among other things, interviewing students in schools and giving them a questionnaire and watching them in class. I asked them to do a poster about what they thought geography was, and they loved it. For 20 minutes they sat and they drew some really, really beautiful posters, and I got back and sat down with my supervisor and said, aren't these posters amazing? And he said, yeah, Nick, how are you going to analyse those? And I didn't know the answer. And I found it really, really hard. And that was 20 minutes that students had spent on their time, and I wasn't sure my analysis could do it justice. I actually found out I needed to talk to some of them about why they'd done certain things and what things were supposed to represent, because there was a danger I would read things into the posters that were no way meant or intended by the students. I didn't think about my analysis before I did my design. That was my mistake. Analysis takes our data out and broadens us from the trunk of our tree and over it casts a shadow, a positive one, over the terrain, so it enables us to say something more than just about what our data is saying. It has to stay lined up with our evidence and our research questions, and so it's important to keep doing that check. I've used the word parsimony at the bottom there. Parsimony is the balance between offering a powerful explanation but not making it too confusing by including too many factors. In statistical modelling, we would say that you might have 4 variables that account for 70% of an explanation, and then if you added another 3, you would only get to 75%. So for a lot more complexity, nearly double the complexity, you only get a small gain in explanatory power. It's not worth it. The best model will have that balance. The same applies in qualitative analysis. Parsimony, balance between simplicity of what you're arguing and the power of your argument or insight. The conclusions move beyond our claims about what we've particularly studied to make wider statements about something of more general interest to people. And this, I think, is like the fruit on a tree at the end of the branches here. And you have to make those conclusions appetizing and easy to digest. That doesn't mean you have to say what people want to hear, particularly if you're engaged in kind of more politically active research, but it does mean that you have to get people to be ready to pay attention to what you have to say in the first place. There's a wonderful framework by Martin Hammersley, I'm going to make a video on it soon, that makes a distinction between claims and conclusions and the wider focus of your research and particular cases studied. And I think that will be a very useful complement to this video. Finally, we always must come back to the question of so what, and how does our tree look compared to those around it? And if you're only in the design phase or thinking of a proposal, how is your tree going to be any more appealing or distinctive from the others around it? Why should we bother looking at this, let alone tasting the fruit or listening to your conclusions? And it's good to think about that. I often ask people to write a full abstract early on in the stages of their research, including their argument, and people say, but I haven't got my findings yet. And I say, well, it's good to think about what you might be saying. If your research goes to plan, what might you expect? What would really surprise you? What would be the most exciting finding you could have? In the design, you've got to think about how you're going to address that so what question. So there we have it, just to reiterate, a tree-based metaphor. Planting your seeds in the right place by knowing why you're doing your research and not something else, justifying why it matters. Planning for a nice thick trunk that won't get blown down if something goes wrong or under the face of criticism. Nurturing your search, checking that it keeps lined up and making adjustments to it if necessary. 4+ parts of the design framework. Strategy, sampling, methods, techniques, and the plus being analysis is not an afterthought. And then thinking about what your conclusions might be and how you make this a big so what case to your audience. Thank you very much. I hope you found this useful. That will be the end of the video. And just like to say goodbye.